Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome. It's a real great pleasure to have Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Meuron here. As you know, both Jacques and Pierre have been leading a thesis studio or thesis group together with Manuel Hertz and Rafi Siegel this year, and the students have been in Cairo and Basel and Boston and Cambridge, and I think it's been a fantastic experience. This is a continuation of a series of projects that they have been involved with. In fact, their connection with the school goes back to the 90s, and we're very happy that this thesis studio has worked so well. Every few years, Jacques and Pierre have had a different kind of project, and I don't know, maybe at some point Jacques will mention something about that, either at the beginning or at the end when we are finished with the discussions. But we're very interested in the continuity of this project. So I'll just leave it to Jacques to maybe at some point say a few words about how they see that, how that continues. It's of course also very important for the school to have both Jacques and Pierre with us. I mean, they are our Arthur Roch design critics in architecture, and two individuals who really played such a significant role in the development and formation of architecture in the past now maybe 30 years or so. Time is it's really amazing what has been done. I think in this school, the moment that they finished the Ricola storage building was a big moment. Their attention to construction, the role of construction, the material of architecture, and the status of actually drawing was something that I think left a huge impression. And then I think from the very beginning, the relationship between architecture, construction, and art really has been such a significant part of what they do. They have collaborated with many of today's really significant artists, a lot of photographers, Thomas Roof, Gursky, and many others. And of course, this connection to artists and to art practice has been very important in their designs of some very significant museum buildings, for example, the Tate in London, and they're doing the kind of part two, the second phase of that now. Amazing projects that have not only connections to new building, but also really the adaptive reuse and modification, in a sense, a kind of conservation, preservation project, which has been going on for some time. Their work here in the school with us and the thesis projects focus on another aspect of their interest, which is really questions related to the city, to urbanization, to more social and cultural dimension of architecture. But I know that today we have a pure architecture lecture, which is going to be a real pleasure. So please welcome Jacques Herzog.
Hello, everybody. I'm also as glad as Mosen who says he's glad to have us here. We're very glad to come back on a regular basis. It's a place where we've always met interesting people, and we've always had interesting discussions, sometimes hot discussions. We continue to have such discussions as, for instance, last night we've had a really nice dinner without any suspicion to ever, heaten up the discussion. But at the end of the dinner, we started to talk about books, and I repeated what I said many times in the past, that I don't believe in books on architecture and that they are bound to fail and disappear even faster than architecture. Architecture sometimes lasts for a few generations, maybe sometimes even centuries. But as everything else, it goes, it disappears, which is also great to know somehow. What I wanted to say is not that I have no respect for people who write books, because we have since the beginning written a lot, and we have always felt the need to for an intellectual and conceptual approach which uses the word and involves the word. But we said it for totally different reasons. I want to point out once again how important it is that a discipline is just what it is. Poetry is poetry, architecture is architecture, literature is literature, painting is painting, photography is photography. We're not so interested in things about things, illustrative things, narrative things, because they use something else to exist. And especially talking about architecture, the great thing, as everybody knows here, when you are facing a piece of architecture, a new one or an old one, the sheer experience, the immediate physical experience is what counts and what makes this piece of architecture survive. Whether it's fragile, made out of paper or wood, like an old Japanese imperial palace, which lasts for centuries, even if it's not very solid, or whether it's a contemporary building, or whether it's an old medieval church. And this immediate sensation, which involves all the senses we have, and that's very key today, that we are not involving only visual senses, reading, so to speak, architecture, but really living it is what we continue to underscore, and we try to teach also to the students, and we try to realize in our work. Well, we could continue this to be more precise and to be more decisive. If there is some time left, we can do this eventually later, Scott. But I would like, from this, to start the presentation here. This is not a book. This is a presentation of slides on works. And as I said, we have always looked for a very conceptual approach, which is, I could say, opposed to a kind of individualistic sculptural approach where the work or the structure or the consistence of the work is defined only through the so-called artistic genius. So it is because it's kind of a product of the individual gesture of someone, of one person. Because we've always worked as a couple, and then later in the large office, we are used or have been used to work as a group, which is also forcing us to pronounce or to speak out things. What do we do and why do we do those things? So it has a verbal moment. It also has a moment where we interpret things, where we say why we believe it should be done this way or that way. It doesn't mean, if I show you this table of contents, so to speak, that we believe our work or the works I propose can be seen only this way or that way. On the contrary, this is just one possible way to look at them and to talk about them now in front of you. I show you a few projects, very old ones, but just in a few slides, and more recent ones, in 3 groups plus 1 group. One is a group that I call House, which is a kind of attempt of figuration. This includes the house in Leimen, then the Parish Museum, then also Vitra House and Prada Ayama Center, which you also find further down in the structure group. Stack, which means a familiar gesture, stacking as something, as a very primitive something, a very primitive architectural gesture to put something on top of something else, a gesture that even a young child does almost instinctively. That has certainly inspired us a lot and been leading to different projects. Finally, the structure, which is the attempt, which is also a historical attempt, to do something abstract, which is, as opposed to the figuration, something which tries to not use existing images of the world or to not immediately relate to some iconic interpretation. we'll see what that means in terms of projects. Finally, we have a single piece, which is the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg, which we see or could look at like a quarry of different typologies. That comes at the very end. I start with the figurative group, the house in Leimen. It's not the first one we've done in such a prototypical way, but it's a very outspoken one, kind of a building which is trying to interpret the house as we've known the house form since centuries, and tries to find a contemporary way to deal with it, and that we lifted it up, and that we try to make it monolithic, try to not make it narrative or figurative, even in small details like the roof or the relation between the roof and the wall. And in some way to make it vulnerable, to tackle it almost like in a stomach where it opens up to the outside. But I just use this as an early example of our interest in that form, that remains without any theoretical background, or let's say without any ideological background, a very interesting instrument to produce contemporary architecture. We've also used it in both versions for the Parish Art Museum in Southampton. In the first one, Southampton is, as you may know, in a breathtaking landscape which is dominated by different water features, with a very open sky, with a very specific light, with a landscape that has since decades attracted many generations of very important American artists, among them Jackson Pollock and Lichtenstein and others. And these artists also always felt like being a group, like being having like a common interest in that landscape as being an inspiration for their work and for their relationship to nature. We have taken that very seriously, and we were very interested in how the artists were working in their own studios. So the studio, we were somehow mapping the studios of some of the leading artists, like this one is the old studio of Roy Lichtenstein, which we visited, and which we then, some of them mocked up, blew up, copied them, so to speak, and abstracted them as if they were transferred to the place of the museum. We organized the museum as a village of individual houses. And some of these houses would be copies of the studios somewhere in the landscape with the same orientation as they had in the real position, which is using the same kind of light exposure, sun exposure, views, etc., but simplifying it inside. That was leading to a very interesting, we believe, concept of kind of a flow of people, very freely organized spaces, and some of them involving, as I said, these studios that would, reinvent somehow the gallery, which is very often a discussion between white cube and other forms of galleries. So that was meant also to be a contribution to how one could build and imagine a gallery to show art. This project then died because of the financial crisis, and we somehow could reanimate it because the energy that came from the parish side was very strong, and they liked to continue to work with us, and we made a radical other proposal maintaining the idea of the simple house, of this very simple figurative idea of a shed. And somehow this new project, which was a radical intervention in the landscape, is even more, let's say, related to the landscape as, let's say, it represents a building that you could see as a kind of a barn. which organizes the galleries in a very, very straightforward and simple way, very flexible and very practical. Also, like artists, like to organize themselves, but not anymore now based on one specific artist. The idea is to do 2 rows of identical spatial units that could be subdivided in different ways, thus creating very interesting diversity. The ingredients we use to make this interesting and powerful was this simplicity, but also the generosity of the spaces in between and the lack of any decoration, of any kind of superfluous element, of any kind of idea of lobby and greatness. We have done quite a few studios for artists. This is one of the last ones. That's the studio of Georg Baselitz, the German sculptor and painter, which, as you could see, preferred a very simple pitch roof with a skylight, very similar to the one that we are currently constructing in the parish. That's the parish again, and that would be a corridor in that new museum. And that's, as you could see already, some structure that goes up. Besides the simplicity, the generosity, we also focused, again, much more than in the earlier version, on materiality, in an almost brutally naked and simple approach to material, to naked exposed concrete, out of which we did walls, sometimes also gallery walls, and benches, canopies with exposed wooden beams, and corrugated steel facade details, and unpainted wood frames. And as I said, these very generous spaces which are connecting between inside out. Nevertheless, this old concept of the village remained in our minds and also in our hearts as something that we could reuse and readapt in a new project. And as we were commissioned, the Guadalajara Contemporary and Modern Art Museum, we somehow started to take it, to reuse it, but again in a different way. And I think that's also part of that lecture. You will see that there are like underground connections between different projects, and sometimes using the same form or the same arrangement, like for instance a stack, as we will see later, you create totally different things, totally different results. In this, artistic behavior or architectural strategies are very similar to natural processes, like in chemistry, for instance, molecular combinations. We saw the galleries also like individual entities. We also grouped them like in a village, but we grouped them much more based on a clear order, orienting itself towards the landscape. And the landscape in this case was amazingly spectacular and precise. A park sitting at the edge of a barranco, of a huge valley, that is really awe-inspiring. This very precise orientation and relationship to north, south, east, west, and to given landscapes is, as you know, a very important traditional element in pre-Columbian Mexico. The landscape, as I said, is so breathtaking that we had to be careful not to fall in the trap of overestimating it or trying to compete with it in a way that would lead to designs that don't make sense, like all too heroic ways to, for instance, use the barranco as the ultimate place to put the museums. We preferred to put the building back into the park, as you could see here, in the park, at the edge of the barranco, as opposed as to put it, for instance, here. And this is very important also as a social idea, because the park with this new attraction of the museum would be the focus point of the poor and the rich being subdivided by this axe, which is a very interesting axe. And this is also a result of our ETH studios, where we analyzed Guadalajara. And we found this line very interesting, this boulevard here, a division line between the rich and the poor. The rich being identified through the number of swimming pools compared to the ones on the other side. So this axis plays an important role to connect and to lead to this site and to offer the park as a place not only for the poor as now, but also for the wealthy people to come together. This is the old project that was proposed there before as a Guggenheim kind of folly, and that was this proposal preferred to put the whole project in the Barranco in such a way, being a sign of something that doesn't want to belong to the city or to the daily concerns of the people using a park. You couldn't alienate art more than putting it in a tower, which is in itself a stupid idea, but also to set it off from the real floor. So the location, as I said, is amazingly beautiful. The park should be reanimated and be open for all groups, social groups. And we lifted up the building so that the park can connect between the city and the museum can connect between the city and the park and the Barranco, and to create a world under that building, which you have to imagine Guadalajara is a city with very, very hot climate, which would create covered spaces for the people to hang out. And the galleries above would allow for an interesting circulation, organizing ways through the building that would allow for 3 different exhibitions, temporary and permanent collection. I don't want to further discuss this, even if the curatorial aspect of that concept is in itself quite interesting. I have to say that Mexico has amazing collectors and very sophisticated people from the world of art, like I don't want to mention names, but they are playing a significant role and increasing important role in the world of art. And also this country produces very substantial contemporary artists. This is the central lobby when you come up from the park level into the main lobby, which then opens up the view to the Barranco and opens up the doors to these different tours, these different routes in the building. Here too, we tried to find a very simple way to bring daylight into the galleries, to not hide the way the daylight comes in, to make with these beams to sort of create a counterpoint to the exposed concrete that we have outside, to make it very robust and solid. In the same way as the adjacent rooms for libraries, for education spaces, and other places which we are fitting out and try to design also furniture, table, chairs, etc. That's a view from the Barranco onto the building, the future building. We use concrete. In some way, the building thus is like continuation of the rock formation of the Barranco. And that's this axis again at night. If we talk about this grouping of spaces, and we somehow said this is part already of this abstract group of stacks or of groups of individual pieces this Jingdao project here is the most radical expression of that approach or that strategy of the stacks. And this is a project that unfortunately we couldn't realize, a gigantic project in Jingdao in China, which was one of the first collaborations we've had with Ai Weiwei, who has become now a world famous person, unfortunately, I have to say. And I just use this moment to say how much we always enjoyed being with him, traveling with him, and doing things together. And this project here certainly is interesting in that it was so fast and we had such a huge program that we didn't know how to work with it, and so we started to arrange the different project groups for this building, which was meant to become a film academy with a very strong ambition to be an equivalent to Hollywood. And because China wants to build a very strong film industry. And we then discovered that the more we really worked seriously on grouping the different program parts, schoolrooms, studios, administration, houses, together, we could, almost like children, we could arrange it in a way that it's very abstract. It's very much really just a stack with no significance. But like, as I said in the title before, being a familiar gesture, a stack is a familiar gesture. Everybody knows what a stack is and what it means to put something on something else. In slightly arranging it in a different way, this gesture becomes, in a strange way, figurative, because it means you open up something, you close it down, you make a gap, you create intimacy. So in a very direct way, it is extremely archaic and architectural at the same time. But as I said, the project died because, like many Chinese projects, when we were in our first years in working in China, we've done many, many projects which didn't continue. But they were like a quarry, an intellectual quarry for us to continue to work on other projects. And two of them could be realized both in some way in this category of stacks. One is using the stack in as abstract a way as Qingdao did, which is for Actelion one of the leading, if not the leading, biotech company in Europe, to create a kind of a headquarter, a business center where people should interact, come together, meet in informal ways, in a totally new way than you would in a generic office building. This building, I can say, was also happening very fast, and is certainly one of the most complicated and complex ones we've ever done. We studied ways to find a way, very simply and easily, nevertheless creating a spatial organization which was very complex. And for this reason, we developed different models so that we could develop it very precisely, geometrically very precisely, even if it gives the impression from outside as being something chaotically put together. As you could see here, when it was under construction, this sheer mess of steel beams was at that stage not something you could ever imagine could create spaces. With this idea of the abstract beam, with the sides open and glazed, we could not imagine the spaces just to be sheer tubes, but also open up for lateral views into the different courtyards between the different work zones, between public zones and office areas, between the different floors. You would never feel totally isolated in one place. You would always be part of the whole thing. So it enhances this idea of being one space, even if you were in a very intimate corner somewhere. It also allowed us to bring in plants and vegetation in a new way. We worked together with one of the most creative landscape designer in the world, which you may not even know here, Tita Giese from Düsseldorf. She's a little nuts, but she's unbelievably talented, very difficult to work with, I have to say, unfortunately, but I would nevertheless encourage everybody to try to do it. It's, she's more an artist than a landscape architect, and the way she uses plants and space is quite interesting, but it's very difficult to express this on slides. The Vitra house that you have maybe seen in publications also is also in that group that I would mention, that same group of stacks, where we put one piece on top of the other in a seemingly unorganized or chaotic way. In contrast to Actelion, which uses abstract tube forms, which have no specific form that would, as a house would do, a house form would do, have a preconceived or pre-informed message, iconic message. And I'll tell you why. First of all, I would like to show you where we are. This is the Basel area, France, Germany, and Switzerland. And it's interesting to see that the city has world-class art institutions in the center, as every European city, but really in a very dense constellation. But the more interesting aspect is that it has, with the Schaulager in the south, the Weiler Foundation in the northeast, and Vitra in the north. Both, this is on the German side. It has 3 world-class institutions that have been created in the last 10 years or 15 years that wrap around and inspire the periphery with interesting institutions that give the periphery more than just a different kind of value. So urbanistically, this plays a very interesting role as a catalyst for the expansion of the city and for the understanding of what the city could be at the metropolitan scale. We talk about Vitra. Before I showed you Actelion, which is in the western part on the border between Switzerland and France. You know Fondation Bayerle by Enzo Piano, certainly one of his better buildings, one of his best, I would say. Not unlike Houston, maybe not as interesting as the Houston, as the de Menil collection, but very interesting building. The Schaulager that we have realized a few years ago in the south, which is this hybrid between a storage building and a contemporary art museum, again using the house form in combination with a totally abstract piece of nature, I might almost say, earth walls. And now Vitra House in the north. And this is an early sketch, and this is now one of these few projects, I would say, where the early sketch is almost, you know, in a one-to-one kind of a way, something that continues to be accepted by us looking at it and bombarding a design all the time. And it survived this early phase because it proved to be quite interesting in what we wanted to achieve. We were interested in this very simple form of a house from different reasons. The content of the project, the program, was about interior design, interior furniture of Vitra. And for that reason, very logically, we needed a domestic scale and the house as the idea for that kind of spaces. Also, of course, in its scale, in breaking down the scale, it would relate somehow to the landscape, which is dominated by this very traditional, I would almost say, bourgeois form. Then it allowed us to stack in the fact that it's going to be stacked, to destroy that form at the same time, to not expose it as that only, but to stack it, to crash one into another, destroying it, and through this destruction, creating new forms and unexpected forms. And that was perhaps the most interesting result of that kind of sculptural approach, that we had the lofty form as a space here, as much as we have the intersection from which we could choose when we shoot one into another what kind of intersection we wanted to use. We produced the variety in an incredible way. Also, it allowed us, and that's also something I would like to put on the table when it comes to discussing again this idea of idiosyncratic or individualistic approach versus conceptual approach, that this produces highly sculptural results with the author remaining innocent and with very clean hands, no clay in it of playing ingenious gestures that would lead to these results, but you can just stand back and look at what these intersections produce, and then you pick the ones that promise the best results for what you want to achieve. In those areas where the different buildings intersect or come together, we introduce vertical connections that would create a space, an independent space in between these different and independent from these house forms that very often produce very interesting and very changing spatial experiences, like a snail drilling its way through the building. That's one of those stairs drilling through the group of the stack of houses. And at the end of these stairs, you often discover a space like this one, which is hosting the most, let's say, precious part of Rolf Fehlbaum's collection of chairs of the 20th century. But also it has a real diversity of other ways into the buildings and through the buildings, which are also being used as hangout spaces and create intersection, create more intimate spaces, niches, lower and higher spaces, which are very useful for the curators of the Vitra home to install their collection. The construction of this project was also a big discussion. You could see before Actelion is a steel construction, which was logical because we wanted to glaze them entirely and open up ways from so you could look laterally out through those beams into the building. Whereas here we wanted to do tubes which on both ends would connect different parts of the metropolitan landscape, the hillside versus the Rhine Valley, etc., etc. You will see that in later pictures. We wanted to do tubes, so we wanted stiff forms. That's why concrete turned out to be the most efficient, the most interesting solution. Now you could say, and we asked this question to ourselves, why wouldn't we leave it like this? We could not leave it for different reasons. We like this kind of very sculptural, very expressive form, but we needed to insulate it, as you may understand, because the climate is not dissimilar to Boston. You need to insulate it, so you would end up in a mess, insulating and waterproofing all this stuff. But more than that, we dislike the concrete as being the finished material because of its pretending power of being a very strong material and a very muscular material. And we wanted to not show this materiality because this materiality was not the key idea. We wanted the form to be more innocent, to be more form and space than an expression of materiality in itself. That is very different, for instance, to what I said before about the parish, where this materiality was and will play an immensely important role in being exposed towards the outside and being a partner in the relationship with the given landscape. Here we decided for this almost black tarboard cladding which allowed us to use the same material for the walls as much as for the roof. So we could create a more homogeneous idea, which would, even if the form is very figurative, to add a sense of abstraction. And to highlight the space and the complexity and the diversity of the space, which is inside, I try to describe as interesting as outside, where the different scale allows for more intimacy and groups sitting together and waiting for the others before they enter the building, for the restaurant area, etc., etc. These benches are for school classes and larger groups as much as for individuals. And here you could see that these buildings are like also, how do you say, call this in English? These instruments where you can look at the landscape, and that at both ends being open, they connect different points in the landscape. And it is true that you become aware of the landscape in a different way. Also because the Vitra campus, being such an interesting collection of buildings of many architects who have never built in Switzerland and Europe before, like Frank Gehry has done his first project here with Vitra Design Museum. Za has done her first building at all in Basel, on that campus. And they are all very modest and small buildings. Just like this is a bit bigger, especially it is a bit taller. And we wanted to go up a bit more because we knew the area better than the others, and we knew that it would be very interesting to not only create an architecture that would create public space underground, but to bring or to connect people with the very, very beautiful landscape in the Rhine Valley. We also moved back because this building, together with Gary's design museum, is like two stones at the beginning, at the entrance of the campus. We moved it back during the process of design process because we became aware that it's much bigger and we didn't want to overwhelm any other building. And we think the quality of this campus is that every piece is standing for itself and creates kind of a world in itself. You can see Frank Gehry's building in the background. Now the third group, which I titled Structure. This is a house or building that you may have seen years before, but you haven't seen it for a while. That was built, or it was started to be built in '82. So that was really at the beginning of our career. And it was the first time, I would say, that we did something that later we ourselves started to call minimalism or minimal architecture. And we were, as young architects, desperately looking for our own way to find an expression in that world of architecture, postmodernism, that we hated, and we couldn't imagine that we would ever find tools or instruments to express ourselves or to find a path in that world of architecture. And so this building is expressing, like a program almost, many things that we still believe are very important. Is radical reduction of the means that we used, and is really an approach that was very much inspired at that time by art, and that kind of art, like minimalism, Judd, Serra, that we were very interested from the beginning, didn't play any role in the world of architecture. That was the time of Aldo Rossi, of Sterling and Hollein, and all these people that have almost disappeared now in the collective memory. And so we used the material that was there. We collected the stones that were from vineyards that were given up, or olive terraces to grow olive trees. So we found the material as a painter finds a motif in nature, and we introduced this kind of geometrical grid that organized the facades, but also the section and the plan. So it was very important for us to say we don't want to make any distinction between inside, outside, plan, section, facade. Everything is one thing. And that's a key thing in traditional architecture that has been forgotten later in architecture. And this is also true, very difficult to realize in contemporary architecture in such a radical way. But we were very interested, especially at the beginning of a career, to do something, to try to experiment with something like that. How far could one go? That's the only interior photograph that is left of the building. We, for some reason, don't have even pictures of that building. You can see in the plan that is very radical in that it is just a cross and that it has no corridors, and that's very important. We wanted not any space be less important than the other, not any space be serving another space. We wanted every space to be of equal importance, and you go from one to the other in some way or another. And no spaces of different, let's say, hierarchy, just of different weight. So that was, in fact, as abstract as one could get without being modern in the way that we have understood modernism. And we have understood modernism could not be used anymore by us as young generation to continue our path into a future. But that's how, of course, we how we started to understand that materials used or adapted in a new way could be really something that hasn't been done, or hasn't been done in that moment of history of architecture. How can I get rid of this now? The next one in this group of abstract structures was the Goethe collection a few years later, perhaps even in a more radical way, at least certainly in a way that attracted the attention of many critics. The Goethe collection was new and an important step for us in many ways. First of all, it was the first museum we could realize. Mosen mentioned the fact that we have been collaborating with artists since the very beginning, so we actually are come much more from this side of the art than of the side of architecture. That's why perhaps also we rejected from the beginning recipes and books and things that would classify whatever we did from the beginning in this or that specific way. So we had this kind of freedom to really find a path. And this moment of minimalism that was unknown or nobody was interested in was leading to this project that I would say is even more radical, because it introduces also light in a new way, in that the building seems to sit on light and not on structure. In that, as in previous project, inside and out are almost identical, and that it is introducing a moment of something which is very robust, very structured, and very ephemeral at the same time. The section discloses something very interesting. We believe the ground is here, and you could see that it's a two-floor building. This is a floor, this is a floor. They are absolutely identical. We wanted, as in the Stauble building, to do something where nothing is more important than the other one. So the basement, so to speak, should be the same importance as the top floor, because no artist would want to sit in this floor in the basement when his friend would be in the first floor. But it's also from the perceptual point of view. We wanted to give the people this surprising idea that even if you're in the lower floor, underground, not to become aware at all that you are underground. This is the light band that brings daylight into the basement gallery. But in fact, it has even a third floor, which is this one, where you get in these two tubes. So the building sits on two tubes, whereas in fact, it seems to hover above the ground, as you could see here. At night, the building seems really to almost float above the ground. And you would not imagine this being a top light in a similar way as this one, bringing daylight into the basement floor. And as I said, the first museum we could realize, we were in fact also already here collaborating with an artist, Helmut Federle. At that time, as I said, was the time of Sterling and Hollein, who realized all these museums, at that time very famous, like Mönchengladbach or Stuttgart. And artists didn't like these museums. They wanted something which was more based on their ideas of lofts, that they started to develop in the 60s and 70s, and architects wanted to do art museums that were more in the Beaux-Arts tradition. And that was not yet a time where artists and art were so close together as they are now. If you imagine someone like Olafur Eliasson, who did this wonderful exhibition here, he's himself, some way, working as an architect and working very closely with architects together. So that link between architects and architecture did not exist at that time. So we were happy to make a radical statement in how a gallery should be and could be. And that building was one of the keys for the Tate responsibles to commission us the Tate at that time, because no other architects wanted or did work on that kind of gallery spaces. It's also, giving evidence of some other things that became important at that time for us, like, for instance, to approach materials in their appearance. At first sight, frosted glass with this pale plywood, birch plywood, that according to the light that shines on them during the day, they seem to be almost monolithic. And with the day changing and the light inside becoming stronger, they fall apart totally and reveal their real material difference. So to also work with materials in such a way was new for us, was also something that somehow was developed in the world of art rather than in the world of architecture. With the Ayamo building in Tokyo for Prada, we could push that to an extreme point. I would say that this building is certainly as much as Tabole, as much as Götz, a building where every single piece is as much facade, interior space, or structure. Every single member is everything at the same time, almost like in a medieval church. Everything that you see is space-making, but is also structural. It is facade as much as it is wall or interior surface. At night, of course, this kind of structural consistency is revealed much better in that those tubes become visible like bones inside the building. And these tubes breaking down the scale of the building and creating more intimate spaces for people to change, whereas the in-between spaces, the more fluid space in between, is for the display of the clothes. So in this way, you can see that building very much in that group of structure, of abstraction, but at the same time, with the roof shape, also with an attempt to become figurative. So to somehow be between these different poles of figuration and abstraction. In this project, but already starting earlier, in the very early ones, we have never really spoken about that. We develop furniture, lamps, sometimes carpets, just for a particular building, in a very outspoken way, of course, here for Prada, for whom we continue to work in the next years. Like this screen that morphed or became a lamp later, etc. In an even more radical way, I would say, than Prada, we developed Lincoln Road a little bit later than the Bird's Nest in Beijing as a pure structure almost, where this idea of space, structure, and facade really collapse in one kind of thing. Lincoln Road, Miami Beach, you're Americans, you know that place probably better than we do. It's a very cool place, very nice, but unfortunately a lot of ugly buildings because air conditioning is driving the rule and is, you know, destroying every kind of architectural innovation, in that it creates boxes which are more or less decorated, like the Deco District, which in fact are just decorated boxes and climate controlled. And we never understood why plants and spaces, architectural spaces like courtyards or other canopy-like driven architecture could not totally reinterpret the architecture of Miami, which is such an amazing city in that it offers amazing opportunities climatically. We were approached by a client in San Francisco, in Miami, who bought the site of a bank and in Lincoln Road, and in a place where not so long ago there was just a forest, and they cut down all the trees to create Lincoln Road. And in a very strange paradox, what now is Lincoln Road is the only place where trees have come back, whereas where the trees are here, they're only buildings. That's what it is now. So in some way, this gardened open shopping mall is kind of an interesting urbanistic attempt to do a shopping mall, American shopping mall, outdoor, and to take advantage of the climatical qualities of that city. So the project site is at the end of that street, is actually this whole complex here. And so the first thing is that we said we wanted to garden to continue till the end of the street. Secondly, the client said, listen, I want to do a garage, but give me a nicer garage. Could we not do something where parking is really becoming something cool and making, you know, eventually we do an apartment on the top and have a, you know, interesting shops. And we said that would be the logical result. We said the first thing is we should go much higher. We have to change the zoning, and we made huge effort. We went to court. We had to make huge transformation of the zoning regulations to be allowed to go as high as the adjacent building. And we said we could do this because we said we did not want to increase the FAR. We just want, or the client just wants to spend more money. That means he just wants to go higher up and create more space, more empty space, which ultimately leads to this architectural quality that was needed to create this plus in architectural or for people to go there to be attracted. And to make that plus not through decoration or through any other tricks, but just through the way that you give more space to breathe, and you use really archaic architectural means like structure and space, and in the most simple and direct materialization, which was everything is actually just concrete. we were inspired by this through this picture that is showing a Detroit theater, wherein somehow, in a reversed way, what was a great building, what was more than a garage, ended up being just a garage, but maintained this kind of amazing place you could go, park your car, and find yourself in amazing architectural surrounding, a truly architectural sensation and experience. So we said, we want to bring the people up in their car and make that experience like a real natural experience, almost like you experience a landscape. And you would want to do the structure in a way that the structure expresses that movement, and try to express the structure in a way that it would never stand in the way of the car moving up or being parked on this or that way. So we made many models for the structure to accommodate the space for the cars parking or driving, and for the platforms or for the floor plates to move in and out, and create this sense of movement and instability and airiness and open space that we believe Miami is the ideal city for that. It has no glass facades, it's a totally open structure. It has, of course, this gardened area in front of the building, and as we will see later, on the top for the apartment of the owner. These are some models that show you how we tested this structure, so it's not just any expression of our personal mood or fantasy, but the structure is really, following the kind of space that is left between the cars. And this is a diagram showing where and how we wanted to distribute the program all through the building, in that it offers something on different floors and makes that building something accessible and public, not just on the street level, but all the way up through the building. The residence was just finished now for the owner, whereas some of the building is already open, and it's being used now, of course, for an event space and for parties and for everything. It's really a mixed use, and the parking is just one reason, actually, why the building was built. But as you can see, these spaces allow for many more activities, and that's also what it is used for very successfully. The landscaped area in front of the project, which has a sculpture of Dan Graham's. The design of this being inspired by Rio de Janeiro's Burle Marx. That's the location of the residence with the pool on the top. That's the way to the residence, which has a private garden on top. As you can see here, that ramps up to the sky. There are not more photographs available really which would show the finished apartment, but you can imagine through what you see here. So certainly this kind of structure has been, through that project and through Beijing's Bird's Nest, being pushed to a very radical extreme. And we are currently working on another project which somehow takes up some of that strategy for a new project in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, for dance and music, a cultural center in the heart of Sao Paulo, in a city which is both ugly and breathtaking, and has some amazing buildings, as you all know, and some of, in a way, modernism has been able to express itself in a way that we always thought, and Miami could do also, in that it really uses this kind of very favorable climate conditions, the very lush vegetations that allow for spaces like this one. This is also a Niemeyer building that we admire a lot, or this restaurant somewhere in Sao Paulo where the tree itself, you know, has architecture on top, and together it works as a canopy for the people to hang out outside. And we wanted to do a building which very much does that, which very much exploits that, before it offers any idea of form, any idea of idiosyncratic kind of obsession with formal exercises, but just with program laid out on the basis of bands, of levels, instead of spaces. If you think of Vitra House or Actelion, those from the beginning had to be enclosed forms, enclosed spaces. Here we wanted to go even further in that the spaces would just be platforms to walk on, and to bring those platforms or those spaces, let's say those surfaces, in some context or some connection with another one. The climate here allowing for that before we define any kind of facade or any kind of volumetric coherence. A bit like in Qingdao, we were fascinated once we started with this operation and laid out all the program. We liked these bands and this kind of very primitive strategic approach as being already architecture and not just diagram. We somehow liked the fact that these bands should remain this kind of almost innocent way that people could just move on, and studied ways how they could come together in a maximized way, a bit like in Actelion, where we studied both how they could be separated and at the same time how they could meet informally. The ingredients here for this building are laid out, being these levels, then the columns, then those areas where we need to enclose to do boxes, and then the resulting composition. We did this also knowing that we wanted to fill up the gaps and the in-between spaces with nature, so the park, which is existing on both sides of the building, would literally walk through the building. Walk through the building in a way that we also wanted the people, you know, the lobby transformation, as it says here, walking through the building and bringing together people in a very interesting way, so that those who go to dance or music classes would meet each other and not just meet always the same people. And the public that goes through the building without necessarily using one of these program parts would also have the chance to meet with people they would otherwise not meet, would they be located or allocated in more traditional buildings. Just a little intrusion. This is the Laban Dance Center in London that we realized a few years ago, which is, as the name said, a dance center also, is a totally different city. That's why the building is much more enclosed with this very ephemeral kind of color scheme, but already had this idea of this interior boulevard where people would come together, people from the neighborhood, but also the students of the Laban Dance Studio, bringing them together in this kind of spine that runs through the building, whereas the building needed to be cladded. But here, of course, the cladding is done in a way that, you know, it somehow reflects the beauty of the London sky, which is very often very foggy and very whitish, so the building could almost disappear. And the light of this kind of colored facade, this is also a project we work together with a London artist, would animate the spaces of the dance classes. The artist, famous artist called Michael Craig Martin. That's again the layout of the program, and we started to color the program, and these colored programs should go in that color that we gave them, should make the model, because we wanted to go a step further. We said to ourselves, how can we make sure that the people really intersect and meet together? We would then also color the people who would go to the dance class and those who would go to the music class, and try to allocate those people in how they would naturally go through the building and go to where they have to go. So we could find out whether you would end up having only yellow or pink or green figures, or whether these different colors would really come together and mix in an interesting way. And that has, again, informed the project, and we had to reorganize some of these bands. Now this, again, that was just a stupid strategy, was leading to something that could be interesting also on the really architectural level, that we would use some of these colored bands and really tint the underside or the upper side of those plates in this or that particular color. For instance, as Adrian Schies does in his plates, you may have seen that are laid out sometimes on the floor. So the project is not yet much further developed. We know that the project will need in the next step to become less innocent, in a way that we need to define better what is the structure, what is the stair, what is really these platform, how are these edges of the platforms really done. And before, we do this rendering, which is almost less good an image than this one, because it pretends to be more than we can say now. But I think it's very important also for students to know that this very conceptual level has to be pushed to an extreme. But then there's a next step that comes in, which is translating this into architecture, where other skills and other things become important and have to be dealt with in a very, very creative way. Otherwise, this concept collapses more and more, and at the end it's just a ruin of the original idea. And that's why I think it's very important that maybe once this building is finished, we would, or maybe based on this one here, we would explain or show how we can go in the next phase and translate the concept into a built entity. Now this is the last project I would like to present today, the ETH Philharmonie, which is now in construction and is both a tremendous challenge and chance for us in our career, because we expect this to be one of our most interesting buildings. At the same time, it's also kind of a nightmare, because this building, and I show you some articles of newspapers, is a bottom-up project, not a top-down project. And that's very strange, because it's such a high culture kind of a project, and that normally comes top down, and the people are criticizing, why do we spend so much money in something like this? You should rather do social housing. But this is a people's moving that said, we want that building because they really loved the design that we produced from the very beginning based on some sketches. And they liked it much more than this project here, which was there in place before. and which was one of these generic transformation projects in an old harbor where you would do some kind of a tall building and then some lofts. And that was already, featured in Lufthansa magazine, and then it collapsed, and we knew that it would collapse when I discovered this in a plane from Frankfurt to New York. And as we said, the newspapers were filled with articles that pushed the government to realize the project. And the project then was set up on the political agenda very fastly, and everybody identified with the project, and everybody wanted it, and the politicians probably felt under pressure. And everything went very fast, also the budgeting and everything went very fast, and that was the beginning of something that ended up in a very negative spiral that was producing more and more cost overrun and rumors and bad press and bad negative spirit that has been lasting now for many years, and we are now more and more working in a way that people try to understand what a greater building they will get, and we feel now in a way that the more the building advances and the more the people can see what they will get, that the spirit comes back that we wanted and hope to create with this project. I think it's very important that not only these signs or this side of positive spirit is being presented or shown, especially also to students, but to also show in which way such a big project, especially such a big public project, is always necessarily very much exposed in the press, and how politicians are identifying with such a building in this way or in that way. And that's how it was presented, that the cost went up, and always, of course, the architect is in some way or another involved, because nobody can imagine that an architect is not responsible for everything, which, as we all know, is not the case since a long time. Anyway, as I said at the beginning, we came to this project through someone who we knew many years ago and said, listen, there's a project there and we don't like it, this very generic tower project, and this would be such an amazing opportunity for Hamburg to do something amazing, and we should do a Philharmonic Hall in that building. That is an existing building, brick building, that should be converted into cultural center. And we said, why don't we do it on top rather than here? And you could keep this integrally and use it, let's say, for parking. And that's how we then presented or created a kind of a rendering, not this like this one, that was producing this whole hype in the media. And soon Hamburg was using this to promote this whole huge thing that is happening here, this urbanistic transformation, which is literally reinventing Hamburg in another part, outside the traditional city. Hamburg is a very beautiful, very traditionally built city, where the skyline doesn't go beyond a certain height of about 20-25 meters, from which only clock towers are rising up. And clearly the ETH Philharmonie, which is more than 100 meters tall, will be gigantic in this city. But it sits in a totally different area. It sits in an area which is surrounded by water and where a totally new scale opens up and is being anchoring the city in a new place. From that point of view, this building is also opening up another chapter and giving the city a possibility to grow without needing to remain in a Disney Worldian way, stick to their old heritage. So one of the elements, I try to explain now the different ingredients of that project. As I said, it's like a quarry for different typologies. First of all, we have this kind of socle, this brick building that we try to leave untouched. It's a very interesting heritage or conservation issue that we just literally drilled through that building a kind of a tunnel that brings the people up to that floor here. And so in contrast to other concert halls or other cultural buildings where you would go from the street directly into the building, you would make that trip through that building, first landing here and then go up to this main platform from which you would access the concert hall or the hotel or the restaurants or the different other program parts which are wrapping around the central court, which is the Philharmonic Hall. One decision was to not use the same material, but to do it something which is more ephemeral, which is more relating to the sky and to the water. That's why we said we wanted to do a glass building, but we don't want to do a generic glass building like an office building that uses these greenish glasses that we know so well from everywhere. So we said we wanted to do something which was moving and which was using bent glass. So we developed these different mock-ups. We developed a form that was horizontally opening and one that was vertically opening. The horizontal opening being for the apartments, wrapping around, and the vertical ones for the hotel rooms that would offer a louver to air, to bring air into the hotel rooms. So with this kind of move, we would create the facade, which is very lively and which would reflect the sky as much as the river, much more than in an office building, kind of a curtain wall facade. The second important element is to access the building. To make that, when I say we conserve or we preserve or renovate that brick socle, is that we want to make it appear even more powerful in that we leave it almost as it is and we just dig a tunnel through the building, which is a long escalator ride. That the only difference to a normal escalator is that it's slightly bending, so that starting here, you would not know exactly where to go. And the more you come up, you would end in this window that you saw before in the facade, where you then immediately have a look onto the river through the existing brick facade. That's an old rendering. The tunnel will be clad with a rendered surface, clad with some mirror-like tiles. And from the terrace, you would go up to the main lobby level, to this main terrace, which is the height of the skyline of Hamburg, from where, as I said, you have all these church towers. It's amazing how traditionally organized Hamburg is, and it's even more interesting that this new urbanization in the old port allows for a new scale and a different type of city so close to the old city. This diagram shows the whole program that we realize in this project, the socle that we keep, the tower, the tunnel that we drill through, the lobby that you reach, the terrace, which is like a landscape opening up in a new landscape between the Philharmonic Hall and the hotel tower and the apartments. And the second shoebox-like music hall. Those are model shots of this terrace, this main space that is more and more revealing now its real dimensions, which are very promising, and the stair that would bring people from that lobby up to the main concert hall. And into that foyer space, which is wrapping around this Philharmonic hall in the center. This is a space we have been endlessly dealing with based on models, because honestly drawings are very difficult to control, and also in a computer you don't really get that sensation of the real scale and the real spatial qualities. It either looked too bad or too good, and both is not very good. So that is one space that will soon be finished and will certainly be a very interesting element of this project, all that in between. But of course, the main question is actually, what do we do here actually? What kind of a space do we do? And what kind of a Philharmonic hall do we want to do? The roofscape you can see is here to hold up the different large-scale spans, but the space itself, the Philharmonic space itself, is something we really wanted to understand from the beginning, where we could go and what we wanted to do. For this reason, we went back to the very origins, to the Greek theater, which is related to the landscape, curved in the landscape, and offers a very precise geometry in that landscape. We very much like that immediate or simple arrangement. We also, of course, are fascinated by the Scala. And why are we fascinated? We are fascinated because it introduces a notion of urbanity, like a facade where now the spectacle begins, and everybody is looking like out of a window. And we especially love very much the height, which is almost like in a stadium. We also like here in Bayreuth, of course, the idea of the tent and the kind of festivity and the kind of arrangement that is expressed in that image and in this kind of coming together in a very special way, being assembled under the roof, under a tent. So that also is certainly an important ingredient of our architectural approach. Then, of course, Scharoun, but this is so good that we said we don't want to be influenced and inspired. All the other Philharmonic halls that have been done since Scharoun have been dealing with this and trying to use this as a model, but we have found out that Scharoun is not a model. Scharoun is already the perfection of his own model. So whatever you do would be less good. So we tried to do something that uses the idea of centrality, but tries to rearrange all this kind of way that it builds up vertically and change the way we deal with it. We started in a much freer way of arrangement, and we found out that that was nice, but was too random. And we said we wanted to go back and find out something which was more geometrically precise and sharp, and something at the same time that was much higher, that was using somehow our experience of building stadiums. We wanted the immediacy of a soccer stadium combined with this idea of centrality, with this idea of the tent being assembled under a tent, and with this idea of an organic form, but that is not developing in one way, but is developing in changing ways. The roof outside playing an important role in that idea of the tent and of the central piece, which is a chandelier at the same time as it is an acoustic tool. To control the acoustics, as you may know, is a key element in the success of such a music hall. We only have that kind of images which don't really tell the quality we will get. Of course, here too, it's about intimate versus very generous open spaces. It's about materiality. We developed this material which is computer rendered, computer-based, porous gypsum surface that in somehow is remindful of the roofscape outside, but is very sophisticated in its acoustic function. And that will be used to clad the whole auditorium. The building is much more advanced now than these images are showing, but I just show them to prove the building is going up. And that's more or less what we will get. Thank you very much for your attention. I would very much love to answer questions and to enter in a dialogue, should there be any need for this, and then eventually say a few things about what we plan to do in the future here.
So there are some microphones. Maybe while people are moving, I could ask you one quick question, which is about I want to ask you about the challenges of contemporary practice. I mean, you showed obviously these 3.5 categories of the figurative, of the stacking, the structural, and in a way the last category of the Philharmonie. And ask the question about the challenges of practice, both in a kind of general way and also a specific way. General way because you've set up, in a sense, this idea of certain groupings of issues that are important for you, that have influenced your work. But at the same time now, you are, for all intents and purposes, just because of the challenges, the size of the practice, things like this, you have many of the conditions of a corporate practice. And at the same time, you are trying to work in ways that's very different from the kind of identity formations, if you like, of a corporate practice. So I think it would be interesting if you could speak to that. I mean, are these categories somehow helpful for you also in the office in terms of having certain ways in which these typologies are helpful in terms of addressing projects, because you have, I don't know, 200 people and you have to manage lots of different projects. Clearly you can't handle all of them between you and Pierre. So, so what is the relationship of creativity and imagination and pushing things to always be in some ways innovative in that kind of context?
Well, I mean, that's the key question. We are not 200, we are almost 400, so it's even worse. No, but it's clear, as long as we stay healthy and are motivated and interested, we can only do what we've always done, which is a kind of avant-garde, author-driven architecture. That's what we like and what we want to do. Should we try or should we need to make the firm smaller one day or another? That's possible. I don't have the answer for this. But it's clear that we would not see any way that we could make the same company work with many more people, or let's say let the teams work in categories and say, well, do it this way. I would suggest you should take the abstract one and mix it a little bit with the figurative one. These categories are not general categories. I use it here and maybe never again, even if I many times use the term of figuration or abstraction or stacks. but not as something that is like a family or an official term in our company. We have nothing in the drawer, and we've never done the same thing twice, I think. But of course, it would be ridiculous to say that even if our projects are all very different, they also play with each other. I mean, there is, of course, similarities between Vitra House and Actelion, but these differences, or these similarities, in fact, and that's the paradox that I love so much as almost how we work. You know, the paradox is the key to our work. The paradox is that because they are so similar, these strategies, they create such a diverse result. So I'm more interested in how you can create diversity and something that seems right for this solution rather than for this one, than finding possibilities to establish a norm or a rule or a style. We have no style. We have absolutely no style.
There are hands up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you stand up? Yeah.
Yes. Thanks very much, sir, for your presentation. And I personally very like your projects because, as you said, you have no style. And there are so many strategies or concepts or materials or inspirations that you can use. And nobody can tell what is your next project. I'm personally always curious about your next project with higher expectations. And so my question is, there are so many things, so many, as you said, inspiration strategies that you can use, and how can you choose one to persuade yourself and also to persuade your partner, because you work collaboratively, right? And you said you work like a couples, and you always agree with each other. Is that always the case? And how can you efficiently collaborate with each other? How such kind of collaboration can brilliantly dedicate to your architecture? Thanks very much.
Nice. Thank you very much for your appreciation. Pierre sits here. We have known each other for such a long time that even if we are two, you know, normally that makes things more complicated. But I think we're both quite fast, and we work together without any jealousies and any obstacles. So it's a very fast computer that you have like more capacity than just in one. Plus we have partners and with whom we've been working also a long time, and I think it's very important that things come on the table. You lay them out like if you are cooking. And I on purpose showed some projects like the Sao Paulo one or Qingdao one or whatever, or the Vitra, where the project or the program is laid out. And then one option is, of course, that you start to play with this, and then you do all these possible things, you know, which are sometimes very ridiculous or childish. And then sometimes it leads to really unexpected qualities, and sometimes you have to reject it and start again. So you know, there is really no recipes in how you do architecture. But once it's there, the analytical potential of what you have done is very important. If you cannot somehow try to understand that what you've done seems to attract you for this or that reason, that it has a real coherence or it has a real complexity in it, that you can talk about. But before, you could not talk about. Before, you cannot say, well, I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then I do this. It would lead to some kind of boring, unarchitecturally worthless thing. But once it's there, you could say why it potentially is interesting or why not. And we have that dialogue. I mean, we are training ourselves. We want to, you know, to trigger these discussions in the same way as I did now. I could perhaps do a lecture using almost the same projects and tell you totally different things, you know. And that's more important for me than to say or to insist on saying this building or this project belongs to this or that category, and I would love you to see it this or that way. I think that's not interesting. And now I come back to the very first statement I made. It's not interesting because the only thing that is interesting is you who go there and you like it or you don't like it. Because if you are in a generation or 2 generations, people don't use the building anymore, and it's worthless because people also don't care about it and don't like it, it disappears. And that's okay. But some of the greatest buildings survive because people love them, because people just love them. And that's much stronger than someone telling you it's interesting and important because of this, 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 and this, because nobody cares about what you explain them. It's like in a love affair. It is or it is not, you know, and nobody has to explain.
Okay.
Yeah, we all love you.
Please, go ahead.
There may not be a style, but there seems to be a bit of a value pattern. When I hear your vocabulary, it seems quite precise and very clear. And you talk.
Need to speak a little bit closer to the mic or speak up. Sorry, it's hard to hear you at this end.
There may not be a style, but there seems to be a value pattern. I was just listening to your comments, and they seem to be quite clear and quite precise what you're saying, and in terms of frugality of material, generosity of space, lack of ideology, and more pragmatic. Could you just maybe talk about what the Herzog compass is? We may not know the destination, but can you talk about what your value system is, and does being Swiss figure into that at all, or being from Basel?
Sorry, acoustically.
He said I know you don't have a style, but there seems to be a value system that's manifested in all the projects. So what is the nature of that value system? Has it got anything to do with the fact that you're Swiss?
Maybe it would be more interesting to hear from you what you believe is our value system. I don't think that I have a value system per se. I said something is important that I believe architecture appeals to the different senses, and not just to the visual one or to whatever. But I couldn't put this on the table up front, Maybe the gentleman with the blue pullover could give me further explanation. He seems to have a value system. Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. Maybe you have a value system. That's exactly the point. This kind of ideological preconception, which I think is really a reason why there is so much bad architecture.
Yes, please, in the back.
Hi, thank you very much.
Oh no, then Matthew, then speak up. Sorry, I thought we were going somewhere. Please, you go.
Yes?
Yes.
Thank you very much. As you were talking about your projects, you spoke about them a lot in terms of their the feeling, the sensation, and the sense of awareness that they would create. And I suspect that might have to do with some of the references that you use, some of the metaphors, some of the figures that you choose in your work. But I'm wondering, what are the boundaries and the limits to feeling and sensation and awareness? What are some of the constraints that you might apply to feeling, sensation, and awareness that would thus enable you to rigorously use those things in your work?
I don't really understand the question, but I again say something dangerous, but somehow architecture is like nature. Let's say a tree is here, a house is here, and some just see this is a tree, this is a house, and that's it. And that's fine. There's no problem with this. If you like, you can see more. If there is more, you can smell it, you can take a fruit, you can whatever, and the house may offer you other opportunities. You may discover other beauties or other advantages or even smell or even whatever. And that's what it is. I mean, it's interesting to do. Complexity is defined through this, that if you look at it more carefully, you discover something that goes beyond. Let's say advertisement is not complex. Advertisement can be analyzed in a way that it's an interesting analysis, but advertisement has a clear purpose. It tells you you should smoke this or that blend or you should whatever. But that's it. That's a clear message. And architecture has no clear message. No message at all. And art has no message. You know, and if you look at a piece of red paint on the wall, you just see this is a piece of red paint. But if you look more carefully, maybe there is more. And what you see more is not what the artist wants to tell you, but is what you see in that piece. And that's much more interesting than what the artist wants to tell you, or what an architect wants to tell you, or what the stupid book wants to tell you. Because it's about power. The book is about power that wants to tell you how important the author is who has written the book. Whereas a poetry is never about power. It's just about this or that poem. That's it.
You've got a whole thing going on about books, which that will take a long time. But I would say that I thought that one of the key things is also this question of construction. Isn't construction the way in which your sensibilities are in a sense also constructed, that's also part of that kind of limit? When you show the structural thing, I mean, it's the precision of the measure of the house, which actually is also part of the definition of the limits in terms of the conversation about your sensibilities. No, you've made a big. I mean, that's an important part of it.
I mean, there is architectures where you can use construction, and there is others where there is no issue because our structure, or let's say the construction, cannot be taken as an ingredient. But that's why every project has a different potential. We don't overestimate materials or colors or construction. It's just ingredients, But yes, if an architect has no clue about structure and construction, it's not so good. But if we live in a world increasingly where, let's say, you don't even have access to that because the architect is removed from that, which is increasingly the case and is a danger, is a pity because it continues to play an interesting role, and I try to show why, And let's say if in Sao Paulo, in the next step, we need to somehow make this hold up, the whole thing, And the more we introduce, let's say, vertical structure, it might ruin the project. So we have to find something using structure to make it really be even more powerful than just these conceptual models. That would be a way to talk more clearly about that particular question.
So who's got the mic? There's a lady here, and have you got the mic? Yeah. Then you go, and then you.
Like the sustainability, the green projects, energy efficient projects, passive houses are the famous terms of our milieu. I wonder if you have any green agenda that really drives your projects.
I think that leads us to the next semester. No, I honestly think that, I think these questions are more interesting on an urban level than on a specific question for one building. You can put solar panels on the roof, you can do this or that. We've always said, that architecture has to be intelligent in that the doors and the windows are more or less on the right spot, and that's how it begins. And if you do those things right, you're already pretty good in all these issues. But mostly this is not the case, so it's a serious architectural issue also. But let's say on a more global level, or in a way that it really would lead to the future, how could our cities be in the future? How are they now? How can we rethink them? We have to find ways to do this and to find also new analytical tools to do that. And we try to start something this semester, in the next semester, where we try to use food as a central point from where we try to understand how cities are organized now, how they are shaped through that topic, how you produce it, where you produce this, how much is locally produced, what's the energy that you need for this, what's the water resources, how is waste being dealt with. it's amazing, since I'm involved in the World Exhibition 2015 in Milano, which is under the label of How to Feed the Planet, is a huge topic. And we are in contact with slow food people, Carlo Petrini. This is so incredibly interesting in that it opens up your eyes in a way that you would never have thought, that food as a starting point to understand everything else, which is labeled under sustainability or energy and all these things. And we try to start next semester, and we would like also to select some Harvard students to be part of that investigation. And we would like to probably start in Switzerland and then use also northern Italy, Milano, because of this involvement of ourselves in the World Exhibition master planning, and then go to other continents. Maybe parallel research here in Basel and in Boston. That's still open. But instead of starting with the kind of traditional ways of sustainability, what is energy, what is the water, or, you know, we try to understand it through something which is so familiar with everybody, you know, and which is an interesting place to somehow enter this new topic in a more also sexy way than have this kind of always technical approach to sustainability.
So just to be clear, the way that things worked this year, was that the GST students would actually do kind of thesis prep component, whatever, in the first semester anyway. There would be the trip to Basel, and if, I don't know how this will be figured out between Scott, the department, but in a way, if the component is here in Boston, then that's fine. If not, there would be a trip to Basel, and then the thesis actually continues in the spring semester. So this would be for people who would want to do their thesis in the spring, but they start making the commitment to the thesis program for starting in the fall. And presumably, Andrea would receive the names of the people, or the Department of Architecture would receive the names of the people who are interested in participating in that particular program. With that, I think I want to huge thanks for the semester, for the talk, to Pierre and Jacques, and to all of you. Thank you very much.